We literally don't know very much about the ocean. We only have mapped something like 20% of it. We've only seen something like 1 or 2% of it.
We've only seen something like 1 or 2% of it. Off the coast of Port Stephens, Australia, a crew of hardened crayfish men felt something massive yank their gears straight off the ocean floor. We're talking a lobster pot 3 feet wide packed with thrashing crayfish lifted like a paper cup. Then the water boiled. A pale head the size of a wharf shed broke the surface. These guys had seen whales. They'd seen great whites. But what stared back at them that day made them refuse to head back out. They swore they'd just witnessed a living megalodon. Here's what really happened, where calm waters turned into a nightmare. So, it's 1918 off the rugged coast of Broughton Island, Australia. A crew of seasoned crayfish men are doing what they always do. Pulling pots, hauling lines, counting their catch. These aren't tourists. These are men who've spent their entire lives on the water. Hands cracked from rope burn. Faces leathered by sun and salt. They know every current, every shadow, every weird sound the sea can make. And then, out of nowhere, the unthinkable happens. One of the men is hauling on a line when it suddenly goes tight. Not snag tight, alive tight. The kind of pull that tells you something on the other end has weight and worse, has intent. He braces himself. The rope whips. The boat lurches. In a single violent motion, the entire lobster pot is ripped from the seafloor. Now, you need to understand what these pots look like. We're talking 3 feet and 6 in across. Heavy wooden frames built to sit firm on the bottom, even in rough seas. Each one weighed enough that 2 grown men struggled to lift it empty. Add 2 or 3 dozen thrashing crayfish inside, plus the mooring lines, plus the chain, and you're looking at something close to 150 pounds of dead weight, and something just snatched it like a snack. The water around the boat started to churn, yards of foam, whitecaps where there shouldn't be any. The men froze. They watched the surface bulge. They watched something rise. What came up next is the part of the story that still gives marine biologists chills more than 100 years later. A head broke the water, pale, ghostly white, wide enough, the fisherman said, to match the size of the wharf shed back on Nelson's Bay. For starters, that shed was no small structure. We're talking a building people walk through to store equipment, nets, even small dinghies. So, when these men compared a single shark head to that building, they weren't being poetic. They were trying to describe something their brains couldn't fully process. One of the crew later told investigators the body kept going and going. He estimated the creature stretched at least 150 feet from nose to tail. For reference, that's longer than a regulation basketball court, longer than 4 city buses lined up end to end. The largest confirmed great white shark on record measures around 20 feet, so whatever these men saw, if their estimates held even partial truth, was nearly 6 times bigger than the biggest predator science currently admits exists. And here's the catch. These weren't drunk sailors spinning yarns. These were working professionals with reputations and families. They refused to head back out for days. They left money on the table. They walked away from the only job they knew because whatever was down there had spooked them to the bone. The crew also described how the water moved before they saw the animal. A strange swell that didn't match the wind, a current pulling sideways against the tide. One man swore he felt the boat tilt slightly, as if the mass of a creature below was creating its own pressure wave. That detail alone has fascinated oceanographers for decades because only a truly massive body could displace enough water to physically push a fishing vessel off balance. There's also the matter of the sound. Several crew members said they heard a low rumble through the hull right before the pot was yanked away. Not a splash, not a thud, a deep vibration that came up through their feet. Some marine experts have since pointed out that very large animals create exactly that kind of low-frequency disturbance when they move through water at speed. It's the kind of detail you don't make up unless you actually felt it. But what really happened that morning off Broughton Island? Because the man who took their testimony wasn't just any local listener. Whatever lifted that pot wasn't a whale, and the next part proves it. When science stepped onto the dock. Now, here's where the story takes a hard left. The fishermen could have stayed silent. They could have buried the memory and gone back to work. But word spread fast in that small fishing community. Word eventually reached a man named David George Stead. And this is a key detail because Stead wasn't some bored newspaper reporter looking for a juicy headline. He was a trained naturalist, a serious scientist. He served as the local fisheries inspector for New South Wales. His entire job was to verify, document, and assess what came out of those waters. When Stead heard the story, he didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss it. Instead, he traveled out to the docks himself and started interviewing every man on that crew one by one, separately. He wanted to see if their stories matched up. He wanted to check for exaggeration exaggeration, for panic distortion, for the kind of tall tale that grows bigger every time it's told around a fire. What he found stunned him. Every single fisherman gave the same description. Same color, same size estimate, same behavior, same terror. Stead later wrote about this encounter in detail, and he made one thing absolutely clear. These men, in his professional opinion, were not making it up. He noted that they were hardened to the sea. They had seen sharks before. They had seen whales. They had seen orcas tear apart prey near their boats. None of that scared them, but this thing did. And that fear, Stead said, was the most incredible part of the entire story. So Stead started doing what scientists do. He started ruling things out. Could it have been a whale? No. Whales don't have the body shape these men described, and they don't yank lobster pots off the seafloor like fishing bait. Could it have been a giant squid? Unlikely. The men described a fish, a shark, with teeth and a tail and a hunting style that matched no cephalopod ever recorded. Could it have been a particularly massive great white? This is where Stead hit a wall. The largest great whites ever documented top out around 20 to 21 feet. Even the most generous estimates push the absolute biological maximum to around 25 feet. The thing these men described was at least 4 to 5 times longer than that. And it was pale, almost white. Great whites are gray on top. So that didn't match either. That left one terrifying option on the table, a living megalodon, or something so close to one it didn't matter what you called it. And here's the wow factor most people miss. Megalodon, according to the fossil record, went extinct around 3.6 million years ago. That's the official scientific position. But the deep waters off eastern Australia happen to be some of the least explored ocean territory on Earth. Massive trenches, underwater canyons, cold layers where sunlight never reaches. In those zones, scientists keep finding species they thought died out millions of years ago. The coelacanth, the frilled shark, the goblin shark, all animals once written off in the fossil record, all quietly swimming around while we assumed they were gone. So what if Megalodon was on that same list? Stead never publicly committed to that conclusion. He was too careful, too professional. But in his private writings, he described the encounter as the most credible mass sighting of an unidentified giant predator he had ever recorded in his career. He also pointed out a detail that gets overlooked. The crew said the shark seemed almost curious, not aggressive, not feeding, just present, watching. That kind of behavior doesn't match a panicked or wounded animal. It matches a top predator that knows nothing in the water can challenge it. Stead even went so far as to compare the sighting with reports from indigenous Australian communities along the coast. Some of those communities had oral traditions describing massive pale sea beasts that occasionally appeared during certain tides. Stead noted that these stories, passed down for generations, lined up surprisingly well with what the fishermen had just described. He didn't claim proof. He just laid the puzzle pieces side by side and let readers draw their own conclusions. That naturalist silence said more than any official report ever could. Crossing into global waters. What most people don't realize is that this one encounter on one foggy morning in one stretch of ocean off Australia became the spark that lit a global fascination with megalodon survival theories. And that obsession hasn't died down. If anything, it's grown louder. For decades after 1918, other strange reports started trickling in from around the world. Sailors in the Pacific describing massive pale shadows under their ships. Commercial fishing crews losing entire long lines with miles of steel cable snapped clean. Bite marks on whale carcasses that didn't match any known predator. And Australia kept showing up in the data again and again. Then came the teeth. Now, this is where things get truly wild. Massive shark teeth have been dredged up from various ocean floors over the years. Most of them are clearly fossilized, dating back millions of years. But every so often, scientists have pulled up megalodon-style teeth that appear surprisingly fresh, less weathered, less mineralized than expected. Some studies have suggested certain teeth may only be 10 to 12,000 years old. That's a blink in geological time, almost yesterday by ocean standards. And here's the real kicker. If even one of those dating estimates is accurate, it means Megalodon may have survived millions of years longer than the official extinction date suggests. Maybe it didn't vanish 3.6 million years ago. Maybe it slipped quietly into deeper waters, adapted to colder zones, and kept hunting where humans simply couldn't see. That's not science fiction. That's a serious hypothesis some marine researchers have actually entertained over the years. They don't publish papers claiming a living megalodon exists. That would torpedo their careers. But behind closed doors, several have admitted the deep ocean is wild enough, big enough, and unexplored enough to hide something massive. Then there's the sonar. Modern fishing vessels and research ships use advanced sonar systems that map the ocean floor and detect objects beneath the surface. Every so often, those systems pick up returns that don't match anything in the database. Massive shapes moving fast, diving deep. Most of these get written off as schools of fish or whales or just sonar glitches, but some of them, particularly especially off Australia and around deep oceanic trenches, have left researchers genuinely confused. You see, the ocean isn't flat. It has zones, layers, the sunlit surface where most life thrives, the twilight zone where strange creatures glow and hunt in near darkness, and below that, the midnight zone where pressure crushes submarines and only the most extreme animals survive. Each layer is its own world. In those deeper worlds, prey is scarce, predators are massive, and the rules of biology bend in directions we still don't fully understand. If something megalodon size still exists, that's where it would be. Down there, deep, cold, patient, and get this. Fisheries off the coast of eastern Australia still occasionally report unexplained gear losses at depths where only a massive animal could be responsible. Not just lines snapped, entire steel cages crushed, bait stations bent like aluminum cans. These reports don't make the news because no one wants to be the captain who cried Megalodon, but they happen more often than the public knows. So, when those crayfish men hauled into port in 1918, shaken and pale, refusing to talk about what they saw, they weren't starting a myth. They may have been describing the most credible monster encounter of the 20th century. There's another piece of this puzzle that rarely gets attention. Around the same time period, fishing communities in New Zealand and the Solomon Islands began reporting similar pale-body giants in their waters. Different crews, different boats, different languages, all describing the same impossible thing. That kind of pattern doesn't form from a single rumor traveling around the world. That kind of pattern forms when multiple groups are seeing the same animal. You also have to consider the geography. Eastern Australia sits right next to one of the deepest underwater regions on Earth. The Tasman Sea drops off into trenches that plunge nearly 15,000 feet below the surface. That's its 3 miles of cold black water sitting right outside the fishing zones where these encounters keep happening. 3 miles is more than enough space for a massive animal to hide for an entire lifetime without ever crossing paths with another boat. And the science only gets stranger when you look at how much of the ocean we still can't reach. Inside the unmapped world below, here's something that should make you pause. We've mapped more of the surface of Mars than we have of our own ocean floor. Let that sink in. Our red planet 225 million miles away is better documented than the water sitting right here on Earth. Roughly 95% of the world's oceans remain unexplored by humans, unmapped, unfiltered, untouched. That's not an exaggeration. That's the actual statistic marine scientists quote when they're trying to explain how little we know about what swims below. Inside that 95%, the rules of biology start getting weird. Animals get bigger. Pressure forces strange adaptations. Some species grow to massive sizes simply because there's no predator pressure to keep them small. It's called deep-sea gigantism. Giant squid, giant isopods, Greenland sharks that live for 400 years. The deep doesn't follow surface logic. The deep makes its own monsters. So when people ask whether a megalodon could still be hiding down there, the honest scientific answer isn't no, because we don't know. And that uncertainty is what makes the 1918 Port Stevens incident so haunting. Think about what those fishermen actually describe. Pale-colored shark. Megalodon, based on recent skeletal reconstructions, may have been more bulky and possibly lighter-colored than the modern great white. The size matched, the behavior matched, the aggression matched. Every single detail those men gave aligned with what science currently believes a living megalodon would look and act like if one somehow survived in the deep. Here's the part that everyone misses. The fishermen never said it was a megalodon. They didn't know what megalodon was. The general public in 1918 had almost no exposure to prehistoric shark research. Megalodon wasn't a household name back then. Movies hadn't been made, documentaries hadn't aired. Those men described what they saw in their own words, comparing it to whales and great whites and the size of buildings they knew. And what they described, completely independent of any pop culture influence, matches the modern reconstruction of a giant prehistoric shark with eerie precision. That's not a coincidence. That's data. Let's also talk about the other discoveries that should change how we view this case. Scientists' music have repeatedly found species they assumed were extinct, suddenly alive and well in deep waters. The coelacanth, a fish believed dead for 66 million years, was rediscovered off South Africa in 1938. Alive, swimming, eating, just like always. Nobody saw it coming. The megamouth shark, a massive plankton feeder that grows up to 18 feet long, wasn't even known to science until 1976. Think about that. A shark larger than most modern boats, completely unknown until one accidentally got tangled in a Navy ship's parachute anchor off Hawaii. If a shark that big could hide from humanity until the 1970s, what else is down there? That's where the Port Stevens story stops being a campfire tale and starts becoming a legitimate question. Because we already know the ocean hides massive animals. We already know prehistoric species can survive past their official extinction dates. We already know that the deeper you go, the stranger and bigger things get. So when a crew of professional fishermen claims they saw a 115-foot pale shark in 1918, the scientifically responsible thing to do isn't to laugh. It's is to ask what else might be down there right now while we sleep, while we fish, while we sail across waters we think we understand. Consider this. Submersible expeditions in recent years have captured footage of deep-sea creatures that look like they belong on another planet. Giant sea spiders the size of dinner plates. Tube worms that survive without sunlight by feeding on chemical vents. Fish with teeth so long they can't close their mouths. Each one of these discoveries was unknown just a few decades ago. Each one challenged what scientists thought possible, and each one came from a tiny sliver of explored ocean. Imagine what waits in the other 95%. Submarine biologists have started using a phrase to describe this situation. They call it the shadow biome, a theoretical ecosystem made up of species we have never seen, possibly including predators that have evolved entirely separate from anything in the surface food chain. If the shadow biome theory holds water, then a creature like the one the Australian fishermen saw could fit right in. There's also the matter of food supply. Critics of the living Megalodon theory often argue that such a massive predator couldn't survive today because there isn't enough prey to sustain it. But here's something worth chewing on. Recent surveys of the deep ocean have revealed enormous schools of fish and squid living in zones we previously thought were nearly empty. The midnight zone, it turns out, may have far more biomass than scientists ever guessed. Enough biomass, in fact, to feed something extremely large if it knew where to hunt. And one more thing about that day off Port Stephens still doesn't add up, and the sea still holds its secrets. Let me talk straight to you for a second. I know what you're thinking. Sounds like a wild story. Maybe the fishermen exaggerated. Maybe Stead got fooled. Maybe the whole thing is just an old fish that grew bigger every time it was told. And honestly, that's a fair thing to wonder because that's how legends usually work. But here's the thing. The Port Stephens incident has held up to over a century of scrutiny. It's been examined, picked apart, and analyzed by marine biologists, cryptozoologists, journalists, and curious researchers. Nobody has ever found a smoking gun that proves the fishermen lied. There's no record of them benefiting from the story. No book deal, no fame, no money. They just told what they saw and went back to their lives, or tried to. What does that tell us? It tells us that whatever happened off Broughton Island in 1918 was real to them. Real enough to walk away from their job. Real enough to risk their reputations in a small town where reputation was everything. Real enough to convince a trained scientist that something extraordinary had happened. Now, am I telling you that Megalodon is alive and well right now, swimming through the Pacific? No, nobody can prove that. The bar for that kind of claim is sky high, and no living specimen has ever been captured, photographed, or confirmed. So, the responsible thing to say is that the science doesn't support a living Megalodon based on current evidence. But the responsible thing also includes this. The science doesn't rule it out either. We're left with a gap, a massive, dark, watery gap. Inside that gap lives every story like Port Stephens, every sonar blip, every snapped fishing line, every bite mark on a whale carcass that nobody can explain. They all sit there waiting. Not proof, but not nothing. What most people don't realize is that the ocean doesn't owe us answers. It doesn't care if we've classified every species or written every textbook. It keeps its secrets in pressure and darkness and miles of water nobody has ever swum through. The men who pulled their boats out of Port Stephens that day understood something most of us don't. The sea is older than us, bigger than us, and it remembers things we've already forgot. So, the next time you stand on a dock and look out at the open water, remember the lobster pod. Remember the whitehead. Remember the men who walked away. They saw something. We may never know what, but the ocean knows. And the ocean is not telling. Here's a final thought to leave with you. Every generation of marine science assumes it has discovered most of what lives in the sea. Every generation has been wrong. New species are documented every single year, some of them shockingly large. Just in the past decade, researchers have identified new species of whales, new species of sharks, new types of squid bigger than anyone imagined. The pattern keeps repeating. We think we know. Then the ocean shows us we don't. So maybe the fishermen of 1918 weren't crazy. Maybe they weren't lying. Maybe they were just the first to glimpse something that's still down there, watching, waiting, doing what it's done for millions of years without our permission. Think about how vast that idea is. Think about how many fishing boats, cargo ships, and cruise liners cross over deep ocean trenches every single day. Now think about how rarely anyone looks straight down. We assume the water is just water. We assume what swims below has been cataloged and labeled and studied. But that assumption is built on guesswork, not evidence. The truth is that we sail across the surface of a world we've barely begun to know. Maybe the legend isn't a legend. Maybe it's a warning, a reminder that the surface we walk and sail and swim on is just the thinnest skin of a planet that's mostly water, mostly dark, and mostly unexplored. The fishermen of Port Stephens didn't set out to make history. They set out to catch crayfish. But what they found, or what found them, changed how serious people have thought about the ocean for over a century. So what do you think really happened off Port Stephens that day? A confused great white, or something science still refuses to admit exists? Drop your answer in the comments, smash that like button, and subscribe for more deep ocean mysteries you won't believe are real.